started repairing those ligaments, where you put like you anchor in a piece of Kevlar into the ligament, sure it up, and we can get those folks back in 6 months.
Welcome to episode 149 of The Route, presented by White Whale Marketing. The Route is a glorified sports business coffee chat that has a new guest every episode as they share their experiences and route in sports. As always, I'm Chris Nascimento, and let's get started. Before we begin, just a couple things to cover. As always, if you see here on the video podcast at the top hand of the corner, it says The Route. Underneath that, it says at The Route Sports. That is our social handle on all the different platforms. And the reason I bring this up is because one that maybe most podcasts don't have is LinkedIn. So considering we're talking to all these great guests across the sports business space, maybe you want to check us out on LinkedIn at The Route Sports, where maybe you can grow, maintain, or even just start your network. So you can connect with myself, the guests, or even just like-minded people that are engaging with the post or following the page as well. So check us out there. And each week when a podcast comes out, we'll do a a little post there so you know who's on the episode and what they're about. And then in addition to that, all the other traditional platforms like Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it now, Instagram, and whatever else there is, we'll release podcasts there as well, and you'll see the announcements and some clips for those episodes. So check us out at The Route Sports on all platforms. And then, as I mentioned briefly there, we're on video as well, so you can find us on YouTube. For that, that's going to be underneath the White Whale Marketing YouTube channel. So that's White Whale MKTG. And we have the Route playlist there where you can find the last, I think it's going on 100 episodes or so on video. So you can check us out there. We have clips too. And then for audio, if that's the only thing you listen to, we're on all the major platforms. And if you have the time, take it to follow, like, subscribe, rate 5 stars, allow the podcast to grow a little bit easier. And we're on all the big ones: Apple, Google, Amazon, Spotify, and I think 6 others or so. So check us out there. If you have any questions, feel free to message us. But with that now said, we can get into today's guest. So I'd now like to welcome someone who has 10 plus years of experience in helping athletes and coaches maximize their performance. The Senior Director of Performance Science at the Kansas City Royals, Austin Driggers. Welcome to The Route. How's it going?
Going good. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to kind of get into this. I know when I was a kid, I was always watching, Sports Science on YouTube and ESPN. So not to sound too cliche, but I always found that stuff super interesting. And I know hopefully a lot of the guests are interested in that as well. So as the title says, it's called The Route. So do you mind maybe sharing yours? Where did it begin and how did we get to where we are today?
Yeah, sure thing. And for what it's worth, I think Sports Science, the television show, is most people's frame of reference for sports science. You're not alone there.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Texas, grew up around sports. Both my mom and my dad coached in college and high school. It was a big part of our family. I went up to the west side of Chicago to Wheaton College to play football and baseball. Studied applied health science while I was there. Got an internship, kind of my first experience in sports science, sport performance as a practitioner was as an intern in strength conditioning and sport physiology at the Olympic Training Center in Lake Placid, New York, working with our winter sports there. Went back, finished my senior year of college, graduated, and went to graduate school at East Tennessee State University to study sport physiology and performance. Worked there as a sports scientist, graduate research assistant, with a lot of different teams there, primarily baseball, but there's also the Center of Excellence for Sports Science and Coach Education. So got to work with them. And then kind of during my graduate experience there, I started working in Major League Baseball as a strength and conditioning coach for a rookie affiliate of the Kansas City Royals in Burlington, North Carolina one summer. Loved it. Kind of bounced back and forth between graduate school and professional baseball until I finished my master's. Ended up doing 4 seasons as a strength and conditioning coach with in the Kansas City Royals player development system, and then was brought into the front office in 2016, around the time that sports science was really taking off in Major League Baseball. And I had the opportunity to pitch our front office on what sports science was, how it could impact player health and performance. Got the chance to build out our department based out of Arizona, our player development complex there, and then took the role of Senior Director of Performance Science, which is where I'm currently at now, relocated to Kansas City in 2019 to work more closely with a Major League club primarily, and finishing up my 4th season in that role.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And thank you for sharing your route to date so far. And typically, what I like to do is kind of go maybe back to the beginning and then we'll work our way to where we are now. So let's say going back to your college days, right? When you're first maybe stepping on campus, getting into that mindset, how did you come up with that decision to enter the program that you did? Because I know a lot of the times, whether it's myself, people I speak to, or even, I'm sure students potentially listening or postgraduate students, oftentimes people, let's say, hit a fork in the road, or maybe, you're 16, 17, you're about to make this major life decision and say, hey, I'm going to become an accountant. Hey, I'm going to become a sports scientist. Hey, I'm going to become a physiotherapist, etc. And then once they see it a bit, they're like, oh, maybe this isn't for me. Were you always maybe set on it, or did you have that moment of, hey, you know what, let me actually go down this route instead because I think that's a better fit for me?
Part of it was reluctance, not on my part, more on the part of my parents. They didn't want me to coach. I had done really well in school. Wheaton College is a very academically rigorous program. It was a really good academic opportunity. And so my parents wanted me to like maximize that educational opportunity. And so, like in high school, I thought I was going to coach college football, and didn't really. I like both of my parents were coaches, so I didn't really have a good sense of what else one could do. I think going into college, I was thinking engineering. I've always been extremely interested in like how things work from a systems perspective. However, Wheaton did not have like a fully in-house engineering program. It was a 3-2 with the Illinois Institute of Technology, and I was worried about bouncing back and forth. And so I did applied health science kind of by default because I didn't want to do the hybrid engineering deal and just looking at the majors. That seemed most interesting. And then as I kind of went through my collegiate athletic career, I ended up playing football and baseball, which was required very different things from a training perspective. And so, as I had to change my training quite a bit to bounce back and forth between those sports, what I was learning in the classroom about the human body, human physiology, and performance, and what I was trying to do personally, like kind of came together in a way that I truly found fascinating. Now, again, I still didn't want to coach, and so in the applied health science space, the natural kind of graduate progression is to go to med school or allied health, like PT, physician's assistant, nurse practitioner, something along those lines. So I was actually headed in that direction. And long story short, had an internship fall through between my junior and senior year. A couple of them actually. One in orthopedic surgery. I ended up angling for the National Football League. Had an opportunity there, and the NFL lockout in 2011 hit, and so they didn't have any players at their facilities. And so I was actually like completely scrambling. Needed an internship that summer. Our our head football coach's sister was a 4-time Olympian speed skater. And so the day that this happened, I went in the weight room to lift, and she was in there. And I told her I was in a tight spot. Internship fell through. Like, do you know anybody? And like Winter Olympics speed skating, because she's really plugged into that world. And she made a phone call. And like a week later, she asked me if I wanted to move to New York, which growing up in rural Texas was a bit of a stretch, but at the same time, I'd already gone through the culture shock of Chicago. So it was such a great opportunity at the time to get to, before I even finished my undergraduate degree to have the opportunity to work with some of our best winter sports athletes was a pretty obvious one. Went there, and Brad DeWeese, now the high performance director for the Jets, was running everything at the time, and he was an unbelievable mentor. And I knew very, very quickly that sports science, sport performance, is kind of how all these things really were coming together and fitting in my life, and that's what I wanted to lean into all the way.
Yeah, and just right there, there's so many things I want to get into. I'll try to remember them all, and we'll come back to it. So the first one of the things you mentioned, right? You're born and raised in Texas, and then you kind of moved to Chicago, and then you're saying that the New York move as well. I'm kind of curious, maybe more so from personal, being in Canada. Obviously, when you hear things about Texas, it's so much different when it comes to high school sports, college sports. It's a different beast. I actually lived in the States for 1 year, and near Boston. And remember when we went by the high school for the first time, and I was like, wow, this is nicer than a CFL field, right? Just kind of looking at it. And then I was watching a show on Netflix the other day about, I think it was Texas or Georgia football, something like that. And when you're looking at these stadiums, you're like, wow, like this is different. So I was kind of curious, the impact of that and how that maybe shaped you. Because I was seeing like these facilities that these students have in high school. They're almost like professional athletes, if we're going to be honest, right? So I was wondering if you find those maybe experiences kind of pull you a certain way where, I don't know, maybe once you kind of came up to especially minor league baseball, it was a little bit eye opening, and if that ever kind of turned you a certain way either, because I just find Texas sports is always so different than everywhere else.
Yeah, the Texas high school football piece is definitely a real thing. My high school is actually right in the middle of like the Friday Night Lights schools, and
Wow.
I can attest that it's pretty much like that. And so that definitely has a big impact. And that's I was a much better baseball player than football player, but I think the like how impactful being a part of something like that is, and giving you at such a young age the sense of finding meaning and purpose and being a part of something bigger than yourself, was a very like real experiential and personally impactful thing. And so I think that played a pretty significant role in how I thought about what I could do or wanted to do in sports. My parents were really supportive in that regard. My sister was a much better athlete than me. She went to the Olympic trials, and was a runner-up national champion in pole vault at the University of Arkansas. My dad got drafted out of high school, the Dodgers, but I was not as good as either of them. But my parents never really cared. They pushed us really, really hard, but they pushed us to work as hard as we possibly can, be a really good teammate, play the game the right way, and do everything you can do to be the best you can be. And whatever like outcome, or how good you are, the program you're at, none of that really matters. And so like that football experience actually led me kind of to a different set of schools that I was considering. And then I think the college football experience as well. On one hand, coming from Texas to a small college program, we actually had more people at my high school football games than my
Wow.
college
Yeah.
football games, which is ironic because like the football is better. Like that, the athletic talent isn't quite the same, but like the execution is a lot better. And it's interesting in professional baseball too. When you transition from college to professional, you have guys that are in the SEC at immaculate stadiums, flying around everywhere, and then they're on a backfield somewhere in Arizona or Florida, or like I was in the Appalachian League, which is extremely rural Appalachia, like in the
Mhm.
mountains of the eastern United States. And so you're going to towns of like 10,000 people. Half of most the players on most of those teams are from Latin America.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of players uh, that are having a real crazy transition from what they were used to be in a totally different environment. And you're in that totally different environment, but the players are way better than they
Yeah.
were. So it's kind of the opposite. So I do think having those experiences myself in many ways probably helped me help the players navigate that transition as well.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned that, it's kind of funny to think about when you think of sports in the States, just in regards to maybe the different levels of high school football where it can almost be professional, as you mentioned, where there's more people going to those games. And then same thing too now with especially with NIL in college, these athletes are almost at a higher level, potentially even making more money than if they go pro and then they have to go, let's say, to minor league sports and kind of build their way up, right? Where it's almost a little inverse, where maybe there's some hesitancy, I'm sure, to some athletes to kind of go pro. And I guess building that and kind of going back to your route specifically, as you're kind of mentioning there, you had, let's say, the facilities and even in college to continue training. How did that impact you, especially being, let's say, in a high level of sports in Texas? And if you're playing both sports, I'm sure even at that younger age, if there's a lot of people coming out and you have these high schools that have a lot of, a lot on the line for these sports, were you always kind of training at that young age and having to, let's say, I think as you mentioned earlier, finding different ways to maybe train for football and then switch and train for baseball as well? Or is that something you only learned with time that maybe you had to train differently for those two sports?
I think I learned a lot of that in college, and I kind of learned it simultaneously on two different tracks. I was learning about the base physiology, like the first principles
Mhm.
of training and how the body works in the classroom. But then I was also like having to live that and experience that and meet the demands of each of those sports. And so I think bouncing back and forth between, like being on the field in the weight room and being in the classroom, like either simultaneously or bouncing back and forth was really impactful. And I think that also staged my ability to leverage that in graduate school as well. So I completed my first year of the master's program, and then got the opportunity to work in professional baseball that summer. And then I returned back and I overloaded that next fall to finish all the remaining coursework for the master's program so that I can then take that next spring off, to be with a full season club. So I spent that next year as the strength and conditioning coach for our AA club. And then after that season, I actually went back to grad school to finish my master's thesis and research and complete the rest of the program requirements. And I think bouncing back and forth between, you're learning what you think and what you're supposed to need to know to be prepared when you finish graduate school to go out and apply it professionally. But it's easy, like for people that go straight through that do 4 years undergraduate and then a 2 years master's program, and then they get turned loose into the wild, like into the sports industry. Um, that can be a difficult transition because you've spent, not that the university is not the real world per se,
Mhm.
but you've spent all this time studying and all the principles, and then you're making this like huge transition like out into
Yeah.
the real world. I think the opportunity in some cases that just found me, and then in some cases I created, to bounce back and forth, it was so valuable,
Mhm.
um, both that summer and that next spring, to have the opportunity to do the job that I was training for educationally, to get out there, do the job, understand what it's like, what are the challenges, what do I need to learn, what do I need to get a lot better at, where are the pain points, and then you go back to the classroom and study harder and figure that out and
Mhm.
equip yourself to return to be able to do that. That was hugely beneficial, both undergrad and my master's program. And I think that ultimately influenced. I didn't mention that in my initial overview, but I also pursued my PhD while working for the Royals as a director of performance science. So it's kind of the same thing, and by that time I was in a position where I could do those things simultaneously. Um, but that's been kind of a theme as I look back, the ability to bounce back and forth and pair like the academic preparation with the real world application best you can has been immensely valuable.
Yeah, and I think you just mentioning that's kind of a great point because I think when you look back, even I'm sure in your field that's one thing, but even whether it's business or whatever other degree you're in, I know when I speak to my friends, right? You graduated, you kind of get thrown into the fire, let's say, and then now that you're seeing all these real world problems, kind of mentioning what you're saying, going back and forth, maybe learning it a bit further. Like, whoa, like we never talked about this in the classroom, right? It was all these different theories, and I remember sometimes like that first job out of school, you're like, oh, I don't know how to create a marketing plan. Like no one told me how to create a marketing plan for an inaugural soccer team, right? Or a soccer team in their inaugural season. And like, oh, what the hell do I do, right? And it's
Yep.
almost one of those things. And I think similar to you, right, where if you have that ability to maybe have those questions and figure it out, and then maybe go back in the classroom and maybe ask those questions or maybe learn and study a bit further, then it just allows you to keep refining it a bit more. So that's kind of a cool, unique piece of your route there. And one of the things I kind of wanted to build on as well when you're talking about those two sport training, especially in your field, I find it so interesting because um, you're living it, right? As you're mentioning, right? You're not only kind of going through school, but then you're doing it for both football and baseball. What was the main two differences when you're doing the training for football versus baseball? I'm assuming one was maybe more heavy lifting and explosive, and the other one's maybe a bit more refinement, perhaps. But what was that like, and what was that experience going from one sport to the other and applying those learnings?
Yeah. I don't know how much there is that can be generalized in the sense that it's going to depend on your position and your kind of individual body and otherwise. For me, I was a catcher in baseball and a linebacker in football. So the biggest challenge was I played football at 10 to 15 pounds over my baseball weight, mainly because I didn't have the frame to hold that much weight in baseball and be able to hit the movements that I needed to. And so making a large, you need to be strong and powerful for both sports. So in that sense, it does help. And then being able to tackle the skill component in preparation for the baseball season in a pretty short window is a challenge for sure. Um, but yeah, I think the body composition was probably the biggest one, which again was really helpful because it's not just a matter of what you're doing in your physical training. You also need to understand the nutritional component of that, and so that was a big piece that I like was confronted with, got to learn a lot, and that's really been beneficial as well for as closely as I get to work with nutrition kind of today in the role.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I guess a question kind of builds on that as well. Let's say when you think about students going from high school to college, or even let's say when college athletes then go pro, do you find there's any maybe glaring holes that you see in their, let's say, body composition, their strength, et cetera, their conditioning? Where when I think back to when I was 16 and working out for the first time, I was just trying to get as much on the bench press as possible so you can, tell your friends, hey, I'm benching this amount now. And then everyone's trying to one up each other and you're just going extremely heavy. Now that I'm a bit older and I'm at the gym, I see the same thing where these 16-year-olds are, essentially twigs and they're trying to bench all this weight and they're just going in all these different movements. They're just doing anything they can to kind of push it, and you can tell they're just going to hurt themselves. Do you find there's any of those glaring themes that you can find as people develop through sport where, hey, maybe you don't need to bench as much as you want, but more so um, focus on this instead? So I guess maybe to summarize the question a bit better, what would you recommend for athletes rather than going from high school to, let's say, pro one day? What are some things they should focus on from a strength perspective and maybe a nutritional perspective rather than always just trying to lift as much as possible?
Yeah, I'll come back to you in a second. I think to distill it down to the recommendation is the understanding that the weight room and physical training is really just a means to an end. And that end is to be better at your sport. And if you're going to get better at your sport, you need to understand what the demands of your sport are. And so, in many cases, like you're just using your physical training to do that. But to your point, it's easy to get caught up. There are a lot of errors you can make, really. I think one of the things we have guys all over the map on their training history by the time
Mhm.
they get to us. Like we have high school kids that have never touched the weight room, especially our players from Latin America, which that's getting much better now with what we're able to do training wise at our academies in the Dominican Republic. But it was commonplace to get guys who have never looked at a weight. Whereas you draft a kid from a major U.S. top university program, and they'll have been serious strength training for a long time. And in fact, a lot of times we have to back those guys off and say, you're strong enough chasing, your squat from like 500 to 515 is like the amount of effort that it's going to take to like do that versus how that's going to help you on the field. Like maybe there are other things we can focus on. But back to your point, it's easy for like 16, 17, 18 year olds to get caught up in the numbers or the weight on the bar or keeping up with somebody else in the program and chasing those things, which
Mhm.
is really a distraction for what you're trying to do, which is to use that to get better at your sport.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I think as you're mentioning that, all these different, let's say, videos crossed my mind where I was just seeing, let's say, these college athletes and they're squatting a crazy amount where you see the bar getting bent. And even sometimes I think Nick Chubb is the one that kind of comes to mind. And I think he was squatting 800 pounds or something. I remember seeing that. I'm like, oh, like, should he be doing that? I'm like, I feel like he can get hurt, right? Like there's a higher chance of him getting hurt than actually just doing it. So that makes a ton of sense. And I guess then that other question, the second part to that, do you find there's any maybe glaring errors in regards to people's nutrition? Because I remember when I was in high school, the guys that like some of the guys that were really trying to put on some weight lifting, they're always talking about, let's say, dirty bulking, right? And they're 16 and they're eating all this McDonald's they can because like, oh, I'm just trying to put on weight, right? Just as much as I can so I can get bigger. Do you find there's maybe, let's say, that dirty bulk takes more away than actually, it's providing? Because I'm just thinking of some of these things like that just kind of come to mind, and I can only imagine when you watch these different college, high school shows, you see the different levels athletes are. Some of them are very green, making sure they're super healthy, and other guys are just pounding it away, whatever they can just to put on weight. Do you find there's any maybe specific errors that you can see when guys go to college or even pro that, hey, maybe this is something you shouldn't be doing? And for example, maybe that's dirty bulking.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, the nutrition resources that are put into to sport have come a really, really long way
Mhm.
in the last 5 years, I would say, in particular. Like when I, uh, for example, when I came into professional baseball, we didn't have a dietitian at any level, and I was actually responsible for the pregame meal and snacks for guys, which I don't remember what the number was, but I think it was like 60 or $70 to like feed everybody, which is not
Wow.
nearly enough. So it's like it was store brand bread and like peanut butter from wholesalers and like trying to do everything we possibly could, on sale fruit, like run around these grocery stores in rural America to try to find like enough fuel to get guys through the game. Whereas now we have a phenomenally talented director of sports nutrition coordinator. She has a staff at affiliates to help advise. And you've seen the same thing in college. So there are really great resources now. So fortunately, it can be as easy as just listen to your to the staff you have there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yeah, the same errors that people have been making forever. Gosh, we could have a whole podcast on nutrition fads and poor ways of eating. Yeah, I'd say most of the nutrition fads don't go well for people, particularly when you're eliminating an entire like food group, like some of the more extreme diets.
Mhm.
Yeah, that often does not go well. Um, and a lot of it's the transition from it's not necessarily what to eat, but it's the overall like where you're at in life and what resources you have. So, for example, our Latin American players have a really hard time because the food is so different here. than it is
Hmm.
in Latin America. And so some of the foods that they gravitate toward, like some of the only foods they like eating, or just like condiments, they'll put mayonnaise like on everything, and eat a ton of rice. So like I feel for them in terms of like they're making an adjustment from making that adjustment from one culture's food to another culture's food, but also for kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have guys like I mentioned from major universities. The University of Nebraska practically invented sport nutrition in the U.S. and they have a phenomenal training table there. And so if you take a player from that environment where they never even have to think about their nutrition, like
Hmm.
they show up and the architecture of that just makes it really easy for them to do the right thing. And then they're like in a small club in a smaller city traveling around, they're on the road half the time, at hotels, like trying to figure out like, okay, now I have to take more ownership in how I feel my body and how I find the right things that I need, is a pretty difficult transition for a lot of folks. And then at the major league level, you have the age old temptation of like there is food, there's really, really good food everywhere all the time. Like we joke about having like, oh, time for fifth dinner. Yeah, there's food in the clubhouse. We have an unbelievable chef. But you get on the plane and there's food on the plane. You get to the hotel, there's food at the hotel, there's pregame, postgame. But so because they have infinite opportunities, guys can easily eat their way out of the game, and so that's a little bit different challenge at the top, where you gotta by the time you get there, ideally guys know what they need and when they need it, and that doesn't derail them either.
Yeah, no, that's kind of a great point because I can only imagine the food that's available to them to always be eating. And I guess maybe going from one extreme to the other, where maybe you had, let's say, that $60-$70 budget to feed the team to where now there's these fifth dinners, let's say. Um, if you're, in the position you are and you could control every single athlete, which obviously you can't because everyone's their own individual in that sense and they'll have their own interests. If you could maybe pick what, let's say, an athlete in their prime on the Royals is eating from, let's say, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I know there would be snacks in between. Do you have any maybe ideal things that maybe most athletes should be eating, let's say, in their prime? So let's say 25 to early 30s. This is something that you'd hope these athletes listening, these athletes on your team are eating. What would that be for those three meals?
Yeah. Without going like meal by meal, because that's going to be different for every schedule and positional demands. Like a catcher's doing a lot more than say a left fielder or first baseman, and a
Mhm.
pitcher on his start day would be very different than on the day before his start, where he's not doing nearly as much. So without like acknowledging the nuances of everything and time, day game, night game, all of that, the fundamental principles are going to be the same, like throughout, which is like eat an appropriate number of calories, like don't overfuel or underfuel, appropriate number of calories, with most of those calories coming from lean proteins, lots of fruits and vegetables, um, and quality complex carbohydrates. So again, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and healthy fats. Once you have that in place, there are some things with like nutrient timing, that we can do. So for example, like right after training, getting carbohydrate and protein in their system for recovery is really important. Timing wise, fueling appropriately beforehand, which is immediately post game, but also ahead of that, because a lot of our guys, they not nervous in the sense that they're like terrified to go out there because we play 162 games, but you still have adrenaline,
Mhm.
especially at the major league level. You still have a lot of adrenaline. So for a lot of guys, they have to fuel appropriately earlier in the day because they can't have a ton of food on their stomach immediately pregame. But again, ensuring another hit of like lean proteins, and adequate carbohydrate, preferably complex carbohydrate, to provide fuel throughout the game. is important. But again, the particulars will depend on position, they'll depend on sport, but ultimately, if you're eating an appropriate number of calories, with most of those calories coming from lean proteins, healthy fats, complex carbohydrates, and lots of brightly colored fruits and vegetables, chances are you're going to be doing pretty okay for yourself.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I know we're kind of getting into maybe some minute details there, just in regards to how an athlete can maybe build themselves up, or even just what they're eating. And I guess getting back to your route, right? You talked about the different internship that you had, and maybe how things maybe lined up correctly, where some of them fell through, and then that's what got you that initial internship um, with the Olympic Committee, right? The U.S. Olympic Committee. From there, right? You mentioned how you were working with AA baseball while you're a student, kind of going back and forth and kind of still learning while applying it. How did this maybe initial role with the Royals come about? Because obviously, a lot of people when they're listening to this podcast are all looking for that. What would you say? That break, right? Where they
Mhm.
get that their foot in the door with the major league, the major team, maybe a potential major brand. How did that come through? Was it maybe from your work in the AA system and they kind of knew what you're doing and someone connected you with the right person, or was it really just applying and that's how you kind of got in from there?
Yeah, as you've certainly seen in running this podcast and talking to so many people, there is the element of your preparation where you need to develop your skills, you need to develop relationships, you need to do a really good job in the jobs that you have and be focused
Mhm.
on that. But even within all of that, you still have to have a lot of like what Jim Collins calls who luck, who you're around at the right time, key relationships and key just circumstantial stuff. So even for getting on at the Olympic Training Center, like that wouldn't have happened without our head coach's sister. And then even there, like that ultimately led to my grad school opportunity at ETSU. But of course, that wouldn't have happened if I didn't do a good job in Lake Placid for Brad DeWeese,
Mhm.
uh, which that's like funny story. So because this was just like a phone call thing and like plug me into the system, Brad actually did not want me as an intern. Like he already had his intern, and so he was like told he's getting this person, and he was like, I don't want the person. So I actually showed up. And sorry to go all the way back, but I think this will
Oh
be
no.
of interest is relevant to your listenership. I show up for that internship, and my supervisor like does not want me there or does not want me in the building. And so it was a little bit rocky start because like, man, this guy's like really ignoring me. And as I look back, and Brad and I have a great relationship now, but as I look back, the turning point was one day, and this is like silly, is a silly example, but one day we were talking about exercise selection and like a particular like knee dominant exercise and VMO activation. And we had just been talking about that in class. And I was like, do you believe you can like preferentially activate the VMO, like the inside part of the quad muscle? And
Mhm.
does that actually impact patellar tendinopathy? Or and like the way that I framed that question, like really impressed Brad. And it impressed him enough where it changed his demeanor toward me and it opened the door for me to get to ask him more questions. And then it was just a flood of like me asking him questions and him pouring in and teaching me a ton about everything. And that stuck with me. I'll come back to your question, but that did stick with me because I think the ability to ask good questions is one of the most important things in terms of like building like quality relationships, like proving your worth and getting opportunities. I think it's easy for people to like want to sound smart, um, especially like in the classroom and separate yourself that
Mhm.
way. But I actually think, and people like Ray Dalio have talked about this, the ability to ask really good questions trumps the ability to sound smart. And that's actually the way to get in oftentimes. And that's been true throughout my career. And that's something I still do to this day. And it's evolved. I, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, although not really. Like when I'm going to a conference, even now, when I'm going to a conference and I know a person is going to be there that I'm really interested in, that I really like and respect and like want to talk to that person, I'll spend a lot of time thinking like about them, their expertise, and like what are the best questions I can ask. And I'll write out like 20 questions and then I'll pick a few and I'll refine them and I'll study them. And like I will be so prepared for an encounter that like may or may not even happen. Like I was just at a
Mhm.
conference like 2 months ago in Dallas, and I did this. I went through this process. I had like three what I felt were really good questions, and there was a CEO there from a really successful franchise, one of the most successful in the U.S. And I got to talk to him, but it was in group settings, and I never had the opportunity to actually execute my questions or actually get the chance to ask. But I always prepare that way. And when you do get the opportunity, if you are that prepared, it maximizes that so much. Not in the transactional of like what they think to you. That's a byproduct of it. But what you'll
Mhm.
get to learn from people, especially great people that you're around when you have these little opportunities, is so important. And actually like preparing for that and being able to ask really good questions. And like when I say really good question, again, it's not a question to like try to sound smart like everybody
Mhm.
has the people in class. That's a brutal way to I don't.
Yeah.
It's not to reflect good on you. A good question is like demonstrates that you're thinking about a really important problem in a really high quality way, and
Mhm.
you're digging into the root of that thing and demonstrating that to the person. And I think the other component in my mind for a really good question is in cases like this where it's in exchange with a key person is
Mhm.
what's the unique insight from that person and their background and what they've been able to do as it pertains to your question that they can speak to like nobody else can. And if you can distill that down and formulate good questions on that, that leads to really, really high quality interactions and learning from great people. And I think as I look back, that was like that was my real foot in the door and like Placid, which ultimately like led to other opportunities. So that's one thing for sure. And I think
Mhm.
I hopefully did that systematically internally with the Royals as well. Obviously, you gotta execute the responsibilities of your job at a really high
Mhm.
level, which hopefully I was able to do as a strength and conditioning coach. But part of that was getting back to your question about how that went or how that internal opportunity came about.
Yeah.
Back to luck, like part of it was just sports science was flooding professional sport and particularly Major League Baseball at the time. Like ESPN was picking it up, not like just the show, but ESPN, Sports Illustrated. It was starting to get attention. The Australian model in the UK, what was going on with the Olympic sport, like front offices were starting to pay attention to that and what that
Mhm.
meant for our industry. And so I was like obviously coming from like I had been immersed in sports science prior, and there weren't a lot of opportunities when I was finishing my master's, which is kind of why I continued working as a strength and conditioning coach. I was kind of hanging out, either waiting to go back to do a PhD or waiting for opportunities to come available in college or professional sport. And so I was really rigorous in how I prepared for that. Again, hopefully ask good questions, do a good job. And so I just started doing a lot of like sports science things in our organization and helping our medical staff, our strength and conditioning staff with those sorts of responsibilities. I started either going to meetings or getting invited to higher level meetings. And again, asking good questions in those meetings, being a good participant in those meetings. And by good participant, I mean, you know, contributing value, but also like knowing the interpersonal dynamics, political dynamics of the meeting, to not like it's not about you, it's about like what we're trying to accomplish. So I think I
Mhm.
did enough of that over time that when that really took off in the US, I was at the right place with the right time with just enough credibility and internal reputation in that area where our front office felt the easiest way for them to get up to speed on what all the sports science stuff is that's coming into the sport was to just ask me. And so I flew to Kansas City and got in front of our GM, our AGMs, VPs, and basically I gave a presentation that was supposed to be like 30 minutes. It probably went for 3 hours, and then another like 2 hours of grilling. And a few days later, they brought me into the front office to build our sports science department, which yeah, again, presumably I like there's no way to like it's not like I gave a great presentation and got an internal job offer. I'm sure like the body of work leading up to that, both
Yeah.
in preparation as a scientist, but also the job I was doing and value before that certainly played a role. But
Mhm.
that's kind of how that unfolded.
Yeah, no, I think you mentioned a couple of great points there, and then just how it kind of came to be. I think one of the unique things that kind of stood out to me so far as you're just sharing more things about your route, let's say in the last 10 years or so, specifically within your career, so much things have evolved and innovated, right? In this particular the sports science world, right? Where you're saying more people are paying attention to it. And one of the things that maybe you're saying a bit earlier that kind of just sparked a question to me. I myself, I tore my ACL recently and got surgery in December and pretty much fully recovered now. And I know from going through my experiences and just talking to the different doctors and even just kind of looking into it myself a bit, just kind of, let's say, returning to sport, it's so much easier than it once was, right? So I'm kind of curious, when you look at your current role now, how do you find things have evolved and how do you end up keeping up with them, right? Because I know maybe sometimes when, let's say, someone tore their ACL 10 years ago, their career's done or they're never playing sport again. I know the doctor I went to go see, they're like, oh, like there's potential that maybe you would never play hockey again or something like that. How do you find you're able to kind of maintain that knowledge or kind of keep up to date, or how are you always evolving with the newfound information that's coming in? Because now, you'll see a football player. I think yesterday, Real Madrid player tore the ACL, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, they'll be back in 6 months," right? Like, it's not that big of a
Mhm.
deal anymore. So, how does that maybe impact your role, and what does that end up looking like for you?
Yeah, so performance science kind of sits right in the middle of that, and so I've had the opportunity to be a part of that evolution and how we've innovated in a lot of those spaces. I think the first thing I would say is that's absolutely a group effort. Like it
Hmm.
takes, and fortunately in pro sport, most people got to where they are because they're in the top 1% of all PTs. They're a top 1% athletic trainer, physio, orthopedic surgeon, strength and conditioning coach, sports psychologist. So you're already working with like the cream of the crop in
Hmm.
terms of like all these practitioners who have really mastered their craft. But for the amount of change and innovation in the sport, particularly technology, it
Hmm.
requires that whole group with a shared commitment to continue to grow and to learn and get better. And I think we're really fortunate to have that because it's easy to sit like if you have 30 teams in the league and you're
Hmm.
top five and like player availability or whatever, you're tempted to sit on your laurels and be like, oh well, like we get guys back, we get good outcomes, whatever. If you do that medically, if you do that from a performance perspective, if you do that as a corporation, like you will not be there long because
Hmm.
if you're at the top, other teams are and businesses are trying to figure out how to take you down, right? And
Of
so
course.
even if you are good, you have to always be pursuing learning, growing, and getting better as a group. And so I think we have that, and I think a lot of that is mediated by not just me or performance science or technology, but like everybody committed to that. And there's still we have come a long way. with a lot of things, but there's also still, you can't rush biology.
Mhm.
And so there are certain things that, we can't, like Tommy John, we get, the UCL ligament, which a common injury in baseball, and it's a really bad one because it requires a pitcher usually missing a year. Um, there's only so much we can do to push biology. However, what we can do is execute that process really well, and when we do return them to competition,
Mhm.
I think our players are better prepared now than they were before. Again, we may not be able to take an ACL from like 10 months to 4 months. However, when we do return that athlete to the field, whatever they have, we understand the demands of every position in every sport a lot better than we did, and we can now track progress and how we're preparing that athlete to meet those demands when they are cleared to return to competition. But yeah, again, it's at the organizational level, everybody committed to continuing to get better, and then ultimately at the industry level too. To use the UCL example of Tommy John, like now we're it you can't do this with all types of tears, but if it's a smaller tear and it's on a proximal part of the ligament, then we've started repairing those ligaments where you put like you anchor in a piece of Kevlar into the ligament, sure it up, and we can get those folks back in 6 months, and we don't
Wow.
have to do a complete reconstruction of the ligament. And that's not like, our team physician isn't sitting around like inventing surgeries per se, but the commitment to the at the industry level, the commitment to that kind of, the all boats rising together with the tide if everybody is committed.
Yeah, and probably I have to start wrapping up the podcast. Otherwise, I'll just keep asking all these different questions because when you start mentioning things like that, I'm like, there's so many things I want to ask. But yeah, who knows? Maybe the technology isn't there yet, or the surgeries, but I'm sure maybe it will because who knows if you're doing things like that now? Who can say what will be happening in 20 years or so from now? So I know that's very cool. And I guess before we wrap up the podcast, I have one maybe more specific question, and then I have two general ones that I ask every guest at the end. What does your day to day look like in your current role? So let's say someone who's finding you on LinkedIn or wants to be the senior director of performance science at a major league team. What does that outlook like when you maybe get up in the morning to leave? I know maybe it changes on game days, off season, but let's say in general, what does that look like?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I can say I've had this role or a similar role for 7 seasons, and the job has been quite different in all 7 of those seasons. Now, part of that's, when you're building, things are going to change really rapidly. Part of that in the middle is COVID is going to blow everything up. And then at the end, things are evolving. So uh, it's I s- and like over the course of a year with the cadence, like spring training versus in season versus off season, that changes my day to day as well. And then
Mhm.
my exact title in other organizations might operate completely differently.
Mhm.
So um, I don't say all that to dodge the question, but I do say all that to say I think everyone is different. Um, Now, at the end of the day, any performance science role is going to be a matter of applying scientific methods and principles to improving player health and performance. Now, how you go about doing that is going to be very different. Um, in my role, I have a pretty big major league focus at the time in the areas that I work in, primarily player availability. So like injury risk reduction strategies, optimizing reconditioning, player tracking, workload management. So understanding that's a lot of like the day-to-day responsibilities. Understanding what did yesterday's game and the last week and series and month require from our players, and how are they adapting and responding to those, and giving our performance staff, medical staff, and coaching staff a good snapshot of what that looks like. So you have the player availability piece, you have the skill development piece of that, which is like making our players better at baseball, which a lot of that right now, at least in Major League Baseball, is biomechanics heavy. Some of it is like practice design and how we set up drills and things like that, but a lot of it is tracking biomechanics, in the sense that we have markerless motion capture in a lot of our stadiums, and so we're able to look at pitching and hitting and how guys are performing, working with our analytics department, and kind of fitting those pieces together. So a lot of it's that, and getting those insights back to our coaches. And biomechanics in particular in baseball is going to be a really common area of focus, at least in Major League Baseball. And I think other teams are starting to do that more as well. But also physical development. So again, how we train, how they're adapting to their training, their demands of their sport, which again, we have a full-time strength and conditioning staff and strength coaches at every level to actually execute the day-to-day of that. But tools and processes we can provide those staffs to do the best job they can. And then I'm also a front office administrator. So player development, major league meetings, budget, maintaining vendor relations for the tools that we have, negotiating those contracts, partnerships with like research type institutes, whether that's a local or regional university that's helping us out with projects, staffing, general kind of high level like organizational design pieces. Those are kind of the areas that I work in, but what that actually looks like day to day changes quite a bit. Beyond the fact that usually in the mornings and early afternoons, I'm doing administrative front office type stuff, and then I'm with the team when they're practicing during the day, and then back upstairs for the game.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you have a lot on your plate, but it sounds like it's all very much interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of share everything to date so far. I have two questions I like to ask every guest at the end, just to kind of wrap it up. So the first, we went through your route so far to date. What I've been saying for 150 or so episodes now, I'm going to live until I'm 103. I'm going to be on a rocking chair thinking back to the good times. So I want to put you in the same situation. 103-year-old Austin on the rocking chair thinking about all the things you've done in your career to date so far. What's maybe one story that's happened so far that's going to stick out to you when you're 103? You're going to remember that still. And you're going to be like, wow, what a moment that I got to do that for work one day.
Oh man. And winning a World Series is a pretty special thing. Hopefully I have the opportunity to win other championships as well. But that doesn't make for a very good story. I think one of the big things, and I can give one like kind of silly story, but it exemplifies it well, is when, especially when you're a young professional or student or whatever, you grow up like watching professional sports, and it's this very like distant land thing, and professional athletes are more icons than they are people. But when you're in it, in many ways, some things are different, but when you're in it, sport is sport, and you have the same archetypes and you have the same challenges and same situations. Like pro sport has a lot of the same things as college, has a lot of the same things as high school, has a lot of the same things as club. So in many respects, those are the same. Like, and also like there is the iconized version of these professional athletes, but underneath that, there's also a human being. And so, and as everybody knows, like if you work in pro sport, you work a lot and you are in it, and it's high stress, it's high pressure. The team is the unit, and I mean, you're like, it's a pretty intense environment. And that group, being able to be a part of the sport piece of like helping these icons like find ways to get better at what they do and accomplish their goals and the organizational mission, That's a really compelling thing to do. But to also simultaneously be in it and spending uh, time with the staff and the players, like as human beings, and all the unique individuals coming together from just the most diverse backgrounds you can imagine, all rallying around this thing and like living life together and trying to
Mhm.
accomplish this really, really hard thing. Like it is difficult for me to convey to people like what it really takes to win a Major League Baseball game. Like that is so hard, and what it takes is unbelievable. So to bring together all these people and get to be a part of that and get in the personal side of it as well, is really, really special. And it's not like a single event per se, but I like things like this. We had a pitcher I watched in the World Series. I got to work with a little bit around that time, but then later on, I think it was 2021. We had just had our second child, and it was, I don't want to say how many days after that I was back at the stadium. I was back at the stadium shortly after the birth of our second child, and we had this pitcher, and he was in the middle of his daily throwing program. So he's out at like 120 feet, like throwing, getting ready to throw a bullpen. And somebody was like, "Hey, Driggs, congratulations." I was like, "Oh, thanks, man." And the pitcher like yelled over, he's like, "Hey, what happened?" I was like, "Oh, we had our second daughter." And he drops his glove and his ball, and he like runs over to me, and he gives me a huge hug. He's like, "Congratulations, bro! Like that's so awesome." Um, and so to have like this guy, a few years ago was like an icon, watch him win a World Series, um, to like sharing in like these cool moments of life is like those type of things that happen along the way. I think will be really, really special to look back on, and really already are to an extent. Um, that's probably those little episodes of kind of where these worlds intersect. I
Mhm.
would imagine will probably be the most special things to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's almost just it's that side of, let's say, sports that people don't always see, right? Where you're saying growing up, you always see like these icons that are this, the spotlights and these huge people, but then when it comes down to it, it's just a regular person that just is congratulating another person on a life milestone, right? So that's super cool. So as we went there, we went to 103-year-old Austin. That was great. But now let's go back to 16, 17, 18-year-old you when you're finishing high school, maybe about to step on college campus for the first time. What's one piece of advice that you've learned over the years so far that if you go back in time and speak to a younger version of yourself or someone listening, like, hey, you know what? This is something I've learned that you should probably know earlier on, or I wish I knew earlier on because it's helped
Hmm.
me a lot since I've learned it.
I think I'd have to go with two,
Perfect.
because I don't think I could pick. And the first is I would tell myself like intellectual curiosity needs to be your calling card. And the reason for that is it provides two really important boundaries. On one hand, it gives you the belief, which I believe is true. You can learn anything if you care enough and you're willing to put in the work and you're passionate enough about it. And I've seen this in every industry. You can put in that work and learn anything,
Mhm.
presumably get pretty good at it. On the other hand, you're never going to have it figured out. So like you have to, even as you do learn, as you do achieve mastery of these things, you have to retain a learner's mindset, because no matter how much you learn, there's always going to be way more that you don't know, um, than that which you do know. And the only way you kill that process is to get to a point where you think you've figured it out and you've learned it all. And I've seen what that looks like when people get to that point. And it's really unfortunate. And it ends up like making some of the best, most experienced people less effective. So, like, I'm I'm committed to that now. I was probably like too arrogant especially like early first few years. So if I could, and as a teenager, I mean, the world is so simple. You think you know everything. I think getting that out of the system early. So like intellectual curiosity, like that is like cling to that. And then I think the other one, which I don't know where it comes from. I know it from Jeremy Jones, who's one of my favorite professional snowboarders, which is the journey is the reward. Especially when you have all these like big aspirations, goals, dreams, doing hard things. And I spend a lot of time in the mountains, climb, hike, backpack, fly fish, all that stuff. And I've climbed a lot. And Yvonne Choniard said the same thing, the founder of Patagonia. Mountain climbers have been called the conquistadors of the useless. When you get up to the top of the mountain, like there's nothing up there. Like it's just the top of the mountain. But so like, and that's so true in everything in your career and life. And like there is no, and I can convey this as getting to work with people who have reached the top of their profession. Not just I'm a professional athlete, but these people are all stars. They're World Series champions. They've won Gold Gloves. Like they've accomplished everything you can possibly accomplish. And there's just no like end game where you get there and you're like, okay, like that's it. The journey really, it sounds cliche, but it really is the reward, and it's the path to get there and the experience along the way. And I think if I go back and make sure, and that's a constant battle you always have to remind yourself of, because you are striving. It is important to have goals and strive toward those things, but you also have to know that it is in the striving and the working for that thing. There is no like situation, job, in-game accomplishment where you achieve that thing and it's game over. It's actually like playing the infinite game over time. So the journey is the reward. I have it in my office and think of it often.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think that's a perfect way to end the podcast, because that's what it's all about, right? Just kind of figuring out how people got from point A to point B, but also just kind of showing what it's all about to kind of get there. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share that. And it's been fantastic hearing your experiences to date so far. Unless there's anything else you'd like to share, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. It's fun.
Perfect. Well, that's it for episode 149. Stay tuned for next week's episode.